Linda Smith spent more than 20 years tortured by strange and life-threatening symptoms that no doctor could identify. Linda was born to a humble farm family in southern Minnesota. She was a strong little girl who learned the value of hard work at an early age. But when Linda hits puberty, her body begins to change in ways that she never expected.
I started just being very fatigued, lightheaded, dizzy, weak, very weak. By the end of the morning chores, I would be very sick.
Despite her strange symptoms, Linda keeps them to herself.
When you're one of 10 kids, you don't go to the doctor for every little sniffle. You just don't. If you had a headache, or if you were nauseous, or if you were coming down with the flu, you were still expected to get your chores done.
Linda does her best to manage her symptoms through the rest of her adolescence. And when she turns 18, she decides to leave the Minnesota cold and farm life for the bustle of Los Angeles. But almost as soon as she touches down in California, a new and very unexpected symptom begins to emerge.
I started to notice migraines. It was very dramatic. It was almost like when I got off the plane, I could feel something's different. They were immense. They were off the charts immense. It made it very difficult for me to focus.
Linda's chronic migraines, along with her dizziness and fatigue, make it next to impossible to concentrate on her new job. Desperate for some relief, she makes an appointment with a neurologist. He immediately orders a CAT scan to see if there's anything unusual about her brain. But the results come back normal.
And he said, you know, everything looks fine. You know, you are in Los Angeles. We are smog capital of the world. Maybe you have a sensitivity to the smog.
Linda resolves to manage her symptoms on her own and begins to experiment with various over-the-counter medications, but none of them seem to help.
The headaches were still very intense, just exhaustion. I felt exhausted. I really felt like I needed to get a better handle on my health situation. I thought, it's time for a change.
Linda decides she's had enough of the smoldering LA heat and smog and moves back home to Minnesota. When she walks out of the airport and the frigid air hits her, something odd happens.
Immediately, the headaches were gone. I mean, it was dramatic. It was like, oh my gosh, where are the headaches?
Linda is completely taken aback by the sudden improvement in her health. And as soon as she's feeling up to par, she decides to try living on her own one more time. After just 3 months in Minnesota, she packs her bags again and heads to sunny Florida.
As soon as I get into Florida and I get out of my car, it's like, wow, they're back. The headaches came back. They were at least 10 times more severe than any of the headaches that I even had in Los Angeles.
Despite the return of her dreaded migraines, Linda sucks it up and tries her best to manage them with pain relievers. She perseveres, and soon after landing a job, she meets Dan Smith.
I was working for a delivery company, and Linda was one of the secretaries at a business that I delivered to. And a short time after that, we began dating.
Linda is happier than she's ever been, and a year later, they announce their engagement.
I really was excited about meeting her because she was marrying my brother, who I love very much, and I immediately fell in love with Linda.
It isn't long before Dan notices Linda's headaches, but she assures him that they're nothing to worry about.
Linda was never interested in seeing a doctor. Going to a physician was not high up on her list.
But then, Dan picks up on something that suggests Linda could be worse off than either of them realize.
One day we were out for a long walk, and we came back to our apartment. And as we walked up the flight of stairs, I noticed that Linda's pulse was quite fast. And I stopped and asked her if I could take her pulse rate. It was running so fast I had a hard time counting it. When I asked her about it, I was kind of surprised at her response.
I asked Dan, well, this has happened to you, right? This happens to you, right? He says, no, it doesn't.
She was in great shape, and she really was, and she worked out every day. It didn't make sense that her heart rate was running so fast by walking up a flight of stairs.
Linda Smith has experienced crushing migraines, extreme dizziness, and fatigue since she was 12 years old. But every doctor she's been to has reassured her that she has nothing to be concerned about, and so Linda hasn't worried. But when her husband sees her pulse skyrocket after climbing a single flight of stairs, he insists that she see another doctor.
She took my blood pressure and my heart rates, and she said, you know, something's definitely not right here. But I would like to run an EKG and see how this test turns out.
And just coincidentally, I had spoken with my mother and explained what was happening to Linda, and she asked whether or not there was any chance that Linda might be pregnant. She explained that she had had some scenarios herself where her heart rate changed when she was pregnant.
So Dan went and got an EPT test, and sure enough, I'm pregnant. So I called the doctor back and explained to her it's a positive test, and we decided that EKG was no longer necessary.
The Smiths eagerly await the birth of their first child. But at 6 months, Linda begins to experience some unusual cramping and makes an appointment with her obstetrician. Then, after a brief examination, the doctor delivers some devastating news.
We sat down and he said, you know, I just want you to know that you're very young, you're healthy, and you and your husband can try again. I was devastated. And I remember calling my husband and telling him we're losing the baby. You know, I asked what went wrong. You know, I took my prenatal vitamins, I drank plenty of fluids. What happened? And he said, what we think may have happened in your case is that the baby just didn't get enough oxygen or blood volume. And it wasn't enough to take care of it. I couldn't comprehend that.
Linda and Dan start out on the slow road to recovery. And just 3 months later, they begin trying to conceive another child, despite the fact that Linda's migraines, dizziness, and lightheadedness are the worst they've ever been.
I was very afraid that maybe I could never have kids. This is a dream of mine. I wanted to be a housewife and a mother and to have a large family. I knew something was wrong, but I kept thinking about what the doctors in Los Angeles had told me. Don't worry about it. Try not to think about it. It'll get better.
Linda does her best to push through her painful symptoms, and when she and Dan find out they're pregnant in March of 1987, they're overjoyed.
She was ecstatic, and so was I.
I'm like, this is great. Hopefully everything will work out with this pregnancy.
And in November of 1987, she gives birth to her beautiful daughter, Christina. But within the first 48 hours after Christina's birth, Linda's symptoms take a dramatic turn for the worse.
She felt dizzy again, started to have some situations where she felt like she couldn't hold the baby.
She couldn't walk, you know, she was falling over, very dizzy, woozy. She just was totally wasted.
But Linda believes she just needs some time to recover after giving birth. She decides to take it easy until she regains her strength. And then, one day a few weeks later, she ventures outside for the first time since Christina was born.
This one afternoon, I decided I'm going to take Christina and we're going shopping. I hadn't done that in a while. It's a very warm day out, and I'm thinking, gosh, I could fall asleep. I'm just exhausted. And I turn to go into the subdivision, and when I do, I black out. And I come to only moments before
Linda Smith is only 25, but has suffered from agonizing migraines, chronic dizziness, and a dangerously high heart rate since she was an adolescent. Despite her family's concerns, Linda has resigned herself to living with her symptoms, until she passes out while driving with her newborn baby in the back seat, narrowly avoiding a head-on collision.
I was stunned. I was absolutely stunned. I thought, my God, I could have gotten us killed. I can't ignore this.
Linda immediately makes appointments with a team of cardiologists and neurologists who promise her that they will get to the bottom of her terrifying episodes. But while they search for a diagnosis, the blackouts, or what the medical experts call syncope, continue.
It was happening quite frequently, and if I stood, sometimes I would only stand for 15 to 20 seconds, and I'd be in a gray out, and very quickly afterwards, I'd pass out.
Over the next several weeks, Linda is in and out of the hospital as she undergoes a battery of medical tests. While they can't seem to identify what's causing her heart rate to randomly race out of control, they suggest a drastic measure to help regulate it.
And he said, you know, I don't know what this is, but we really may need to consider doing a pacemaker implant.
Although the pacemaker could control her heart rate and help suppress the blackouts, Linda is horrified by the thought of having one.
80-year-olds have pacemakers, not 25-year-olds. I felt old.
Linda is on the fence about having the pacemaker surgically implanted, but one evening while making dinner, the choice becomes crystal clear.
And I go out to the kitchen, and I had taken some meat out of the refrigerator, and I got a carving knife out to cut the meat up. I remember thinking, oh my gosh, I'm gonna get sick. And I turned around, and just as I turned around, I passed out cold.
I walked into the kitchen and saw my daughter in her high chair, and Linda was collapsed and unconscious on the floor. Next to Linda was the butcher knife.
This was the confirmation to me to go ahead and have the pacemaker implant.
Two days later, Linda is rolled into the OR for the surgery. And almost immediately afterwards, her life begins to change.
I get up and I use the restroom, and I look in the mirror. I have a glow in my face. I thought, oh my gosh, this is what I look like with pink in my face.
After the pacemaker was put in for a long time, Linda saw a really marked difference in what was happening to her. Her episodes of passing out really went away.
Over the next few years, Linda and Dan have 2 more children. And despite her very busy life juggling her family's schedules, Linda is able to manage her migraines, dizziness, and fatigue, one day at a time.
I'm able to get a pretty good handle on some of the other symptoms. I start to drink more fluid, and I start to take frequent rest periods throughout the day.
But on a very hot summer afternoon in 1993, Linda's world is once again turned upside down.
One day I decided I'm gonna mow the yard. And I'm about halfway through when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I get this immense pain that shoots across my chest, goes down my left arm, up my neck, and into my left side of my face. And I get into the house, and I called Dan at work, and I said, Dan, I'm really not well. You need to come home. And I passed out while speaking to him on the phone.
Dan rushes Linda to the ER. And his sister, Mary Ellen, a registered nurse, meets them there. Their fear at the time is that the pacemaker has simply stopped working.
I went out and I spoke with the nurses at the desk. I said, I'm really worried about my sister-in-law. She's having chest pain and her blood pressure's really low. Can somebody help her? They just kind of rolled their eyes, essentially, and didn't really respond.
Linda is discharged the next day without any diagnosis, referral, or prescription.
And I was getting very frustrated to the point where I kind of thought there's no real purpose in going back to another physician. They just don't understand this. Whatever it is, they don't understand it.
Linda Smith has been enduring myriad painful symptoms for almost as long as she can remember. But when her blackouts suddenly reappear without warning, the doctors have no answers for her. Linda is so discouraged, she swears off the medical establishment for good. But with Dan's encouragement, she reluctantly agrees to go to one last appointment with a team of specialists at Vanderbilt University. Within a month, Linda and Dan board a plane headed for Nashville. Dr. David Robertson is now in charge of Linda's case.
Well, I came by her room soon after she arrived, having heard that litany of problems that she had faced.
He sits down with us and he explains what tests they're going to run. And I think, let's do it.
Dr. Robertson's goal is to try to figure out why Linda's heart rate and blood pressure are so variable.
The body regulates blood pressure and heart rate so that they are at the appropriate level while you're lying down, while you're seated, and while you're standing. And that level must be high enough that all the blood can get right up to the brain.
First, Dr. Robertson gives Linda a specialized exam called a tilt table test, in the hope that it'll shed light on her abnormal heart rate.
The head of that tilt table gradually goes up as we are monitoring blood pressure and heart rate to give us the full picture of what the heart is experiencing at that time.
The test confirms that Linda's blood pressure and heart rate hit shockingly high levels when her head is elevated.
Normally, the heart rate might need to go up 10 beats per minute to keep blood going to the brain where it needs to be. In Linda's case, there was an immediate increase in her heart rate of 32 beats. And moreover, the blood pressure had to rise also.
Next, Dr. Robertson begins conducting a test to monitor Linda's catecholamine levels. Catecholamines are a type of neurotransmitter released from the nervous system to regulate heart rate and blood pressure.
What we then did was to assess the catecholamines. During our tests on the tilt table, we found that they were extremely elevated, and this confirmed the nature of her problem. It really had to be orthostatic intolerance.
Orthostatic intolerance, or OI, is a condition caused by a defective autonomic nervous system, the system that controls involuntary body functions like digestion, blood flow, and body temperature. Patients with OI can't make necessary adjustments to counteract gravity when standing up, and blood from their heart, lungs, and brain pool into their lower extremities, causing a drop in blood pressure. Suddenly, all of Linda's symptoms make sense.
If the blood flow to the brain is impaired, a great many symptoms can emerge, like fatigue, rapid heart rate, migraine, headaches. Some people with orthostatic intolerance, well, they have the feeling like you're going to pass out. That's quite common. But there were times when Linda completely lost consciousness. That is very dangerous if you are in situations where you can harm yourself.
And finally, Linda and Dan can understand why they lost their first child.
It's possible that there can be loss of a fetus if blood flow to the fetus is not maintained. We can't be sure in this case if that was a factor in the problem that Linda experienced, but it could have been.
I remember when he left the room, sorry, thanking God, thank you. Thank you, Father in heaven. Thank you. I was so relieved. It was over. It was over. I had a diagnosis that I thought I can start to regain my life. I don't have to put my kids at risk anymore. I can work with this. I can do it.
While Linda feels a definite sense of relief after suffering for more than 2 decades, she can't help but wonder, why did it take most of her life to get diagnosed?
The difficulty in evaluating someone with these kinds of symptoms is that each symptom could have many different explanations.
The good news is that while there is no cure for orthostatic intolerance, it can be managed.
There are drugs which reduce the excessive stimulation of the heart.
There's one more crucial thing Linda can do to maintain her health. Since excessive heat can raise a person's heart rate, this can be especially dangerous for people with OI. The heat in Florida is only exacerbating Linda's problem.
So we made the decision that we would move back to Minnesota, where Linda's from originally. A climate that was better suited for Linda would be better suited for all of us.
Today, Linda's kids are almost all grown up, and she and Dan have dedicated their lives to helping others cope with this little-known condition through their National Dysautonomia Research Foundation.
I thought if you could start an organization that would help to give patients the ability to reach out to other patients would be very helpful.
There are a large number of people that are impacted and can't find adequate care.
And there were times I wanted to give up and not persevere. I knew if I did that, I was going to put my children in harm's way, myself in harm's way, and quite possibly complete strangers in harm's way. And I couldn't do that.